Well, hello. I'd like to talk to you about the Enlightenment, or for a little while. And basically, the Enlightenment. What's going on with the Enlightenment is that people are beginning to re-examine old traditions and old beliefs, and in return, and try to replace them with more scientifically grounded ideas. All right. This is sometimes called the Age of Reason. For that reason, because this idea that we're going to that people can reason their way to finding answers to big questions. Okay? And the time period usually given to it for this is the 1600s, 1700s, all the way up to about 1815 when Napoleon takes over France. And that pretty much puts an end to the Enlightenment. And so what's going to happen here is that it all kind of gets started with the Protestant Reformation. Protestant Reformation was a time period where people really began questioning the validity and the authority of the Catholic Church. That was the only church really that was seen as a legitimate church in Europe. And so when they began questioning them and forming all these what are called Protestant groups, because they were protesting the role of the Catholic Church in government and in their daily lives, groups like the Lutheran Church, the Anglican Church, the Calvinist Church, the Presbyterian Church, all of these are Protestant churches that splintered off of the Roman Catholic Church for a variety of reasons that we're not going to get into. But basically what happened is because of this, people begin to have their doubts on the validity of organized religion and just old traditions in general. Like, why do we do things? Well, it's a tradition. Well, that's a kind of a dumb reason to do things if you think about it. I've always done it this way. Well, what if that's a bad thing to do? And so people began trying to come up with better solutions to this. They began trying to reason their way through this. On top of that, there was the Renaissance, which people began because they rediscovered the art of Rome and Greece, that they began then to question the way things were done in everything, really, in art, in drama, in performances, in music, in architecture, and there's this rebirth in learning, and that's why it's called the Renaissance. It's a French word that means rebirth. And so, and the people who lived during this time, they named this period, okay? They named, we are the enlightened ones, or this is an age of reason, and there's a little bit of arrogance in this, and if you get that sense, that's okay. So let's talk about what they were doing. Okay, so it all starts with the sciences, and it really starts with it was a season of giants in science, and we'll talk with three big ones. A guy by the name of Robert Boyle, a guy by the name of Sir Edmund Halley, and a guy by the name of Sir Isaac Newton. You've probably heard of a couple of those. All right, Robert Boyle, who absolutely hated Newton, by the way, just would not talk to him. If he needed to talk to Newton, he would talk to Halley, and Halley would go and talk to Newton. Then Newton would respond to Halley, and Halley would then go talk to Boyle. And it was kind of funny to picture these great scientific minds behaving like junior high boys. And, so it's kind of funny to think about this. But Robert Boyle came up with he did a lot of research into thermodynamics, and he also did a lot of research into the behavior of gases. And chemistry in general. And there's even a Boyle's law that explains how the relationship between gases and pressure, how a gas behaves under pressure and some things like this, right? He also figured out that why glass distorts light and some of the things that are going on with that, right? And so he did a lot. And then, of course, Edmund Halley named more constellations than any other single individual, because he took and went to the south of the equator and saw all those things, and he named all of them. But what he's most well known for, of course, is Halley's Comet, which he didn't actually see during his lifetime. He read through the records and realized that every 76 years, people were reporting seeing this comet, and realized, oh, you know what, it's the same thing, all right? It's the same comet, and he predicted when it was going to be arriving again, and even though he was dead, his prediction played out, and so they named that comet after him, and that's, of course, Halley's Comet, probably one of the few comets most non-astronomers can name. All right, and then, of course, there's Sir Isaac Newton. Sir Isaac Newton was Mr. Smarty Pants, and he invented calculus, for example. And when you invent a whole field of mathematics, you must be a really bright guy. And he invented calculus to show the physics, the mathematical principles. That was the title of his book, was Mathematical Principles, behind how planets stay in orbit, and why an apple falls, and how he even goes so far as to explain in this book how an object can achieve orbit around, if you could launch it from a cannon, from a hilltop, how that cannonball could achieve orbit around our planet. And so he's doing a huge amount of stuff. He explains motion. Basically, someone once said that he explained how 95% of physics works. And so he's just a giant in science and math. And these weren't the only guys. There was guys like Kepler, who was explaining how you could predict the motion of stars and planets. And there were people like Antoine Lavoisier, who was the father of chemistry, who came up with the first law of thermodynamics, this idea that the amount of matter in a chemical equation is going to be conserved no matter what. And so there's all these great things that if this was a science class, I could go on forever, but I'm not going to. People began to think, well, if scientists can come up with principles for these big questions like the movement of the stars and planets, then people should be able, social scientists, should be able to come up with answers to the big questions of what government is best for people, what economic system is best for nations, how do we achieve happiness and harmony and peace, and all these different things like this by applying reason and scientific principles. And this really gets started with a social scientist, a writer, a French guy by the name of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote a book called The Social Contract. And basically a social contract is an agreement between two people. And everybody you meet, you have a social contract with, whether you realize it or not. And a social contract is one person has this standards of behavior and one person has this standards of behavior. And as long as nobody violates these standards of behavior, then we're all going to get along and there'll be peace and we're not going to have any conflict. A good example of this would be between you and I as student and instructor. Okay, so for example, I contract, my side of the social contract is to treat people with respect, grade fairly, to be prepared for class, and to give it my best effort every time. Your side of the contract is to do your best on the assignments, to come to class prepared, to do your best when you're in class and doing schoolwork. And as long as we are both doing our part of the contract, then we should have a positive outcome, which is hopefully going to be a passing grade. And that's great. But what happens when one of us violates our part of the social contract? Let's say you don't do your best. Well, then you typically get low grades because you violate, because you get questions wrong on tests, and you don't do discussion boards, and your grades go down. So we don't have a positive outcome. If I don't grade your papers fairly, then there's conflict between the two of us, and sometimes that conflict even goes so far as offices and deans and things like this. But there's not harmony and there's not a positive outcome. We're not going to walk away from this organization, from this arrangement, and going, "Ooh, I am so glad we got to argue over grades today." And so that idea of a social contract is going to be explored by some authors. All right. For example, there's going to be another author by the name of Thomas Hobbes, who will write a book called Leviathan. And he's writing it primarily talking about Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell, remember, was the Protestant leader who led the rebellion against the king, and the Puritans and all them, the moderates that stayed behind and cut the head off the king of England. Okay, Oliver Cromwell was their general. They called him Lord Protector. And the whole point of Leviathan, according to Thomas Hobbes, is that early primitive life was very short, very brutal, and very ugly. And so for safety, people came together into communities and governments, and they endowed one person basically with all power. power of executive, power to create laws, the power to enforce those laws. Basically, that person is judge, jury, and executioner. And the social contract is that the Lord Protector, the Leviathan, basically, will protect the people from threats inside and out, and the people will obey. And they will pay their taxes. And there's no room in there for rebellion or for questioning the government, because this is the best form of government, so why would you question what's best? All right, so that's Thomas Hobbes and the Leviathan idea. So a couple decades after him, there's going to be another writer by the name of John Locke. And it is difficult to overstate the importance of John Locke in U.S. history, even though he never set foot in the Americas. He wrote a series of essays, and the most important of which is called the is John Locke's Second Treatise on Government. And you're going to read a part of it in class. And he lays out that says, no. Before government, we lived in a state of equality. And that we had to come to government, that all people had certain natural, inalienable rights. Sound familiar? Here's what he actually said. That all men are created equal and are endowed with certain inalienable rights. And among these rights are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Does that sound familiar? Sounds really close to something that's going to be said in the Declaration of Independence. All right. That all men have these certain inalienable, and the inalienable means that you cannot take them away. All right. All men always have a right to life. They all have a right to liberty or freedom, and all people have a right to pursue property, all right, to gather stuff. Okay, the problem, without government, it's very difficult for individuals to protect these rights. And so governments are instituted among men for the preservation of these rights. Thomas Jefferson is going to take that. He actually comes to Philadelphia with a copy of this book in his bags. And he is going to take that idea almost word for word, and he's going to put it into the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. And he's going to say all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that governments are instituted among men for the preservation of these rights. All right, that's the Declaration of Independence. And so John Locke is coming over here and he's saying, all right, you know what? But what happens when governments fail in their social contract? All right, people have a right, should be loyal to their government. They should pay their taxes. They should be obedient to laws. They should be good citizens. And government is supposed to protect their rights. But what happens is that when governments fail in their social contract, when governments fail to protect the rights of individuals, there's a fourth right that John Locke described, and that is the right to replace your government. Governments are not ordained by God. They are instituted by men. And this is a big difference. This idea that governments are instituted by men is going to fill the English-speaking world, and it's going to really permeate down into the colonies, and is going to be embraced by people who felt like their individual rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of property were being violated by the English crown. And they're going to look and go, you know what, we have a right to get rid of this government and form our own government. And do it right this time. And that this is an inalienable right, that no one should be able to ever be allowed to take this right away from us. And this idea is going to drive the founding fathers, especially the men who write the Declaration of Independence and the men who voted for the Declaration of Independence, are driven by this Enlightenment idea that if a government does not protect your rights, you have a right to replace it or fix it. That's why we don't have a permanent president or legislature. All right, because, and even our judicial, which serves for life or until they're impeached, or they die, or they retire. I mean, they're not even technically really not for life. All right. But every 4 years, we have an election and we elect a new president. We have the right to fire our president because we're not happy with how he or she is doing things. Every 2 years, we have a right to fire and replace our representative in Congress. Every 6 years, we have a right to replace or fire and replace our senator that represents us in the Senate. All right? Because if government is not protecting our rights, that's what you get to do. And that's one of the underpinnings called popular sovereignty. And republicanism. And it's one of those things that just is the foundation of American thought. And so these two Enlightenment ideas, John Locke is going to have a huge influence on the American colonists. All right, Thomas Hobbes, not so much. Although it is interesting to note, Thomas Hobbes did not say Oliver Cromwell came to power by the authority of God. It was not a divine right of kings thing. He's still saying that it's a social contract between men and government. And so this idea of divine right of kings is out the window in the Enlightenment, regardless of which position you're taking, Hobbes or Locke. In addition to this, there's other people who are writing, people like Voltaire. Voltaire wrote, that was his name, was Voltaire. He had a real name that I don't remember. He was French, and he wrote a book arguing that people should be allowed to worship according to the dictates of their conscience, called Candide. And then there was another person named, forgot it. Anyway, Adam Smith. And Adam Smith wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations, who argued that nations become wealthy when governments stay out of economic issues. That's called laissez-faire, hands off, the invisible hand. He's the one who creates this idea of supply and demand, and that markets will set the best price to benefit people in the most effective way. And that the best thing a government can do is maintain an army for defense, maintain highways and other infrastructure as you need to, right? And then stay out of the way. And that's going to be published in 1776. And once again, the founding fathers, they're going to embrace this idea of open market and laissez-faire capitalism, and that's going to become the model for our country. And it's going to be based on this idea that that's the most scientifically valid, that's the best, most reasoned position, is that capitalism is king and that government should stay out of economic affairs. All right, a little bit later, that's going to be revisited by some other writers, including people like Karl Marx, but that's after the Industrial Revolution, and we'll talk about that at a later time, maybe. These Enlightenment writers, these Enlightenment ideas, are going to just seep into the fabric of America, and they're going to influence why we rebel. They're going to influence the government that we establish after we're successful. They're going to influence the way that we think, and to a point that actually continue to influence the way we think today. People argue over market-driven decisions for various problems in our society or non-problems in our society, depending on your point of view. We continue to hold elections. We talk about the possibility of impeaching people. We talk about this idea of replacing our government. That's what an impeachment would be an attempt to replace a portion of our government. We talk about putting limits on government. Government should not have all power. These are all ideas that are remnants of the Enlightenment and that continue 250, sometimes 300 years after the fact. Okay, so I've also included on this page, I've also included a PowerPoint that has some more information in there. I encourage you to look at it. And if you have any questions, be sure to ask them in class. All right, until then, I will talk to you later. Bye-bye.